I was extremely uncomfortable at the thought of my oldest child attending this school named after a man who fought to defend the very principles and rights that we detest and oppose. I no longer felt like I should be complacent with this because, as I'm sure you've heard a lot lately, complacency is complicity.
Arguments arise about history and race, and I want to ask you, why should we let the name of a literal divider represent the inclusivity practiced at SAISD schools?
Have we reached completion and perfection? No. We still have a way to go. But I see this as I say, a first domino, and this will have sweeping effect, which I do not think will be uniting.
It was in 1949, right here at 2500 Sherwood Way, where the middle school named after the Confederate General Robert E. Lee was opened.
And so I think now more than ever, it really is time for us to consider changing this name, and to do so in a fair way that has buy-in from everybody.
But little did San Angelo ISD know that almost 70 years later, in 2017 and now in 2020, the school's name would be up for debate based on Lee's ties to the Confederacy and slavery of African Americans. But it's also fair to say that this recent argument has had some extra fuel.
What do you want? I can breathe. Please, the knee of my dick. I can breathe shit.
Following the tragic death of George Floyd in Minneapolis, peaceful protests, not so peaceful protests, and riots have erupted. Businesses, cities, and monuments have been the casualty of civil unrest. Here in San Angelo, protests have also taken place.
Black versus white, white versus no, come together, y'all.
Some with messages to promote the cause, while others
San Angelo alive!
would advocate their own agenda. But in the wake of Confederate and even Union monuments from America's Civil War coming down, it's furthered what's called the cancel culture movement to remove figures from our society of yesteryear that might be considered objectionable or offensive, or perhaps have ties to discrimination and racism.
Because this statue embodies the fact that our freedom is only on white people's timetable.
Believe it or not, Abraham Lincoln, our nation's 16th president, who's responsible for abolishing slavery along with Jesus Christ, have been condemned by this so-called cancel culture, a movement Allen West, candidate for Republican chair of Texas and former Florida congressman and retired United States Army lieutenant colonel, explains.
So this cancel culture is all about an ideological agenda. It's about, situational ethics. It's about, a moral relativism that says that I will apply this to what I believe in and not what you think is right or wrong. And I think that we should not go down this path. You cannot appease, you cannot compromise, you cannot negotiate with a mob. But yet we find some people trying to do that.
Amidst America enduring the most civil unrest since the 1960s, San Angelo citizen Jessie Ramon started a petition to remove Robert E. Lee's name from the middle school. Ramon declined to go on camera with San Angelo Live, but did issue this statement. This is not a man that deserves the respect San Angelo has adorned him with for the past 70 years, and it's time to change that with Robert Lee's permission himself. It's often forgotten that Lee himself, after the Civil War, opposed monuments, specifically Confederate war monuments, believing countries that erased signs of Civil War recovered from conflicts quicker. With Ramon's petition to remove Lee's name from the middle school came another petition, this one from San Angelo native Billy Munguia, to keep the name.
My side is basically, I know what he was all about. And they can believe what they want to believe. I don't care. I just know that this present day has nothing to do with back then. And a lot of people went to school there. They were proud to be rebels then. They still say they're rebels now.
As far as history is concerned, when it comes to Robert E. Lee, we reached out to a few local historians along with Dr. Michael Shane Powers, assistant professor of history at Angelo State University, whose studies specialize in the U.S. South and Civil War era. My question to him, who was Robert E. Lee, and why did he side with the Confederacy?
Robert E. Lee was a Virginian, and really a Virginian's Virginian, meaning he was from a very blue-blooded family. The Lees were an established family, and an established family of planters and slave owners, meaning that they were really in the upper crust of society economically, wealthy, as well as politically. Robert E. Lee fell into the camp of what our historians call cooperationists, meaning Lee still supported slavery and defended slavery, but Lee wanted to wait and see what Lincoln would do. Virginia as a whole, as a state, did just that. And following Fort Sumter, when Lincoln calls for troops to put down the rebellion of states like Texas who secede in defense of slavery, Lee sides with Virginia.
Gus Clemens, a local writer, historian, and author of the book Concho Country, explains Lee's other ties.
Well, in 1857, he owned 189 human beings, and he was considered a harsh taskmaster. Some slaves escaped, and he gave them 50 lashes and then had them put salt in the wounds after the beating.
Like many of the founding fathers of this nation, Lee's past is linked to slavery. But there's another element of Lee's history that should not be forgotten. U.S. Army General from 1814 to 1861 Winfield Scott said in his characterization of Lee in the Mexican-American War, "The very best soldier that I ever saw in the field." In fact, it was Lee's efforts that were instrumental in a number of battles in this conflict that would lead to a United States victory in which Mexico gave up all claims to Texas and recognized the Rio Grande River as what is known today as America's southern border. The victory also gave way for the United States to obtain from Mexico parts of present-day Arizona, California, Nevada, New Mexico, Utah, and Wyoming. Following America's first large-scale victory on foreign soil, Lee was assigned to the Texas frontier from 1856 to 1861. Lee was the commander of the famous U.S. 2nd Cavalry based at Fort Mason. He led patrols on a line of outposts at Fort Cooper near Albany, Fort Johnson right here on the Concho River, Fort Chadbourne just outside Brant, and all the way down to San Antonio. Something Garland Richards, president of the Fort Chadbourne Foundation in Brant, talks about.
All during the Mexican War time period until the Civil War time period, he is protecting the West Texas frontier. You had raids that were coming out of Mexico, raids that were coming out of the west of this point. Was primarily Comanche country, so he tried to set up and was assigned to set up a buffer zone in between the Comanche Nation and the white settlements that were happening all the way from here to San Antonio.
According to the Texas Tribune's report in 2017, there are more than 180 public symbols of the Confederacy in Texas, and dozens of those monuments dedicated during or after the Civil Rights era. Of the schools or institutions in Texas named after Robert E. Lee, there are 19. In this region alone, from Abilene to Amarillo over to El Paso, there are 42 public symbols of the Confederacy, with 4 in San Angelo. Tom Green County is named after Confederate General Thomas Green. Beauregard Avenue is named after Confederate General P.G.T. Beauregard. Lee Middle School is named after Confederate General Robert E. Lee, and Ben Ficklin Road is named after Confederate Major Benjamin Ficklin. But an interesting question to ask in all this is, why were monuments erected in schools like Lee Middle School named after members of the Confederacy over 70 years ago? An argument can be made from Fairmont Cemetery right here in San Angelo, where Confederate soldiers have been laid to rest. In 1949, there was about 1 to 2 generations separating the current generation then from the time of the Civil War. Honoring the past was likely what they were doing. Down in Cristobal, just a decade prior, Confederate reunions were held on the banks of the Concho River. A monument was erected in their honor in April of 2013. Meanwhile, our local historians provide their suggestions.
Following Reconstruction, North and South agreed to reconcile their differences by burying those divisive issues of race. So what we have by 1949, at the time that the middle school is named Robert E. Lee Middle School, is really a moonlight and magnolias myth of a South of slavery where slaves weren't treated that bad, where slaveholders could be nice. So whether it's films like Gone with the Wind or others, by 1949, Lee is regarded in the North and the South, but especially in the South in states like Texas, Lee is regarded as a heroic figure of the past. Why? Because the history of slavery and the black experience following emancipation really was brushed under the rug.
Much of West Texas and much of Texas is named after members of the Confederate Army. We see streets, we see monuments. I mean, should this conversation end with just Robert E. Lee Middle School? I mean, for crying out loud, our county is named after a member of the Confederacy.
He was a member of the Confederacy, but he was more a hero of the Texas Revolution. Just get that straight. Mm-hmm. There's no easy answer to this. I'm like the lawyer that tells you, I can argue this flat or I can argue this round. Just tell me which side you want me to be on. I would assume if I were a black person celebrating slaveholders and people that fought to keep human beings enslaved would bother me. On the other side, I think that the people who are offended by those things also need to be compassionate to the people who are for them. So I don't think they're going to change Lee Junior High School's name, to be honest with you. But it might be nice to start a conversation to show that he's a complicated person.
History will forever remind us that America's past is far from perfect. But according to Lieutenant Colonel Allen West, the battle to improve American society should have nothing to do with Robert E. Lee or long-deceased members of the Confederacy.
I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia. And in Atlanta, Georgia, you have one of the largest granite mountain foundations structures in the world. It's called Stone Mountain. And on the face of Stone Mountain is the image of Robert E. Lee, Jefferson Davis, Stonewall Jackson, and Ulysses Grant. Now once upon a time, the Ku Klux Klan used to meet on top of Stone Mountain. They used to burn their cross up there so everyone could see. Now I remember the day when me and my friends hiked all the way up Stone Mountain. And when I looked over and I saw the image of Robert E. Lee, he didn't oppress me. He didn't offend me. He had done nothing to me. As a matter of fact, if you know the history of Robert E. Lee, after the Civil War, he made sure that a black man was able to take communion in the church that he was attending. The real issue we should be talking about is not Robert E. Lee and a middle school named after Robert E. Lee in San Angelo, Texas. The real thing we should be talking about is the failure of another Texan. That man is called Lyndon Baines Johnson and his Great Society programs, which destroyed the urban population centers all across the United States of America. His war on poverty has been a decimation of the black family. His welfare nanny state has destroyed small business entrepreneurship in our inner city and black communities. But we don't want to talk about that. What we instead want to do is whistle past the graveyard, like they used to say down south, and get focused on the trivial things such as a middle school named after Robert E. Lee.
But even in defeat, 6 months following the surrender of the Confederacy, General Lee would acknowledge what America needed the most. In a letter to Confederate General P.G.T. Beauregard, he said, "I'm glad to see no indication in your letter of an intention to leave the country. I think the South requires the aid of her sons now more than at any period of her history. As you ask my purpose, I will state that I have no thought of abandoning her, unless compelled to do so." Meanwhile, in an email to San Angelo Live regarding the name of Robert E. Lee Middle School, San Angelo ISD informed us that a formal and thorough process will begin in late July through early September. 2 virtual community town hall events will be open to the public. The target date for proposed action is set for October. For San Angelo Live, I'm Manny Diaz.